But what I find interesting is I infrequently ask to describe who we are, what we're doing. Recently, with them and Apple, this cardiologist, I never heard of this. We talked very briefly about it. And inevitably, what the response is, that's me. They're all humanists. So what we're just expressing to ourselves and to each other, what I think the majority of modern Jews, they believe it. They're not uncomfortable as I am hearing those words.
Or they are because they're not members of those synagogues anymore. I mean, the membership in
That's part of it.
Reform and conservative synagogues have gone down in part, I think, we would posit it, at least in part, because of the disconnect between who they are and their values and what they're hearing there. Or a hope. I don't assume.
Not always, not regularly, often. Maybe I'm again, I have my generation, I have children, I have grandchildren. Huge grandchildren have a Jewish identity. They usually know how to answer that. And it's very mixed, very mixed. I'd say half of them, but not everyone. And they also think of it as belonging to a temple and going regularly. If they don't do that, they don't have a Jewish identity, which I don't, that's not my
Which is not true.
That's not my definition.
I mean, one of the things they've found in studying long-term Jewish identity is the number one factor is summer camp. You go to a Jewish summer camp. Number two factor is what happens in the home. Do you do Hanukkah camp? No, it's summer camp and what happens in the home. Way more over an episodic trip or what happens in a periodic Sunday school, because it happens every day. Because it happens in a peer group or with your parents, it's part of your culture and your background. Do you see menorahs on the shelf? Do you see Jewish books on a bookshelf? Do you light Hanukkah candles? Do you have Passover seders? That counts way more than coming on a Sunday morning to learn about whatever the topic is for your Sunday school class when you're tired anyways. I mean, it's helpful. I'm not denigrating Sunday school. It's important. And it's often the kids are learning more than the parents do because we're doing better than them. But in many cases, people who are Jewish at home. Again, it has to do with that paradigm shift of what does being Jewish mean? For us, it's ethnicity, culture, family history, or joining that kind of family history in the adoption conversion sense, where if it's primarily religious and you don't believe what the religion tells you to believe, and you don't follow the ritual practices and avoid the foods and all the rules the religion tells you, and you never go to the institution that defines the religion, then people will call themselves a bad Jew or I'm Jewish. Yeah. And if you define it as religion, then most Jews are going to fail at it. But if you define it as family, culture, and heritage, then most Jews pass that because that's how they're Jewish. We just took that, we took the quiet part and said it out loud and made it the center of what we're doing.
So I have sort of, as you know, a kind of a different perspective. And you made me think for a minute because I grew up as an ethical culturist. So and we didn't celebrate anything Jewish.
But you were Jewish. Did you feel Jewish? You have a Jewish identity.
I've come to adopt the Jewish identity. That's what I'm trying to get at. It's like, so my mother was totally non-Jewish. I mean, completely. And we had a Christmas tree in the house.
Sorry, maybe not Jewish. I mean, she didn't have Jewish parents.
She wasn't Jewish at all.
No, she was Swedish.
She was a Congregationalist in Portland, Oregon. So I mean, she never, you know,
She had no Jewish identity.
she knew nothing about Judaism before she met my father during World War II. And he was a Jewish, his family came from from Tsarist Russia. And he lived in Brooklyn and he grew up in a totally Jewish neighborhood in Brooklyn. And I grew up in a totally Jewish neighborhood on Long Island. So in some ways, but ethical culture has no holidays. I mean, you know, it's just you just made me think about that. So like, gee, do we have any holidays? I'm like, no. In fact, the holidays that I celebrated with my family was both, because we had Christmas, but then we went 3 blocks over to my aunt's house and we did Hanukkah. And then I went to Passover at my grandmother's house, who lived in Great Neck, which is, you know, not too far away. And so my exposure to Jewish culture was sporadic in a way, because we didn't do anything. There's no menorah in my house ever. The first menorah that I ever owned was the one that I asked my grandmother to get when I was, what was I, 28? Yeah, I mean, when I came back from Africa, I was already married, and my grandmother was going for the last trip to Israel with her second husband. And I said, bring back a menorah from Jerusalem. And I don't know why I did that, but I always felt more identity. My brother and sister feel no Jewish identity at all, even though my sister is married to a Jewish doctor from Brooklyn. What's that?
You don't think Leslie?
No, not really. No, we had a little discussion about that. It's kind of like, and they were married by an ethical culture leader, you know, so I mean, we were married by her minister in her little town in Pennsylvania. Didn't do a rabbi thing at all. So maybe when we're 50th in 2 years.
Yeah, do it. Yeah.
We'll do another one, yeah. So
Get to break a glass finally.
we could break the glass, yeah. But at the same token, my sister's son, one of the youngest son, married an Indian gal who's a Jain.
Mhm.
But at the end of the ceremony, the pandee put down the glass and my nephew stepped on it, which confused all the vendors in the audience, you know. But I mean, it's kind of a very mixed thing, but for me, it wasn't so much Jewish practice in the home, it was more like Jewish practice in the community. And my high school was half Jewish and half not Jewish, and we had Jewish holidays off because there were so many Jews, and half the teachers were Jewish, more than half the teachers.
So that was in Brooklyn?
No, I grew up on Long Island, not Nassau County, and so it was, you know, but where I grew up, we were still very ghettoized. I mean, Jews all bought into this particular subdivision of Levitt housing in Roslyn Heights because that's the way it was. And there was covenants that black people couldn't buy those houses, for example, until they broke that. And I never knew a Christian in my neighborhood except my mother, Mrs. Golden. I mean, and that was two interfaith families. Otherwise, everybody was totally Jewish. But my friends weren't necessarily all Jewish. I had friends over at East Williston that were Christian. Anyway, it's confusing. What I'm trying to say is that I kind of liked the Jewish culture that I was exposed to. And when people asked me what my religion was, if I didn't want to bother explaining about ethical culture, I just went like, I'm Jewish. Because it was simpler to do. And I understood more about Jewish culture than I did about the Christian culture of my mother's family because they lived in Oregon. I didn't have as much.
Well, and also one of the challenges is that Jewish doesn't fit neatly into the categories.
No.
You know, you think of the three great monotheistic religions of Islam, Christianity, and Judaism, but Jewishness is also an ethnicity. You know, you could be Christian in many different ethnicities, you can be Muslim in many different ethnicities, and there are subsets of the Jewish people, but it's a more of an ethnic ancestry identity. I mean, you're born into it, right? It doesn't have anything to do with, there's no affirmation of belief. Even if you're a male and not circumcised, you're still Jewish. Obviously, Jewish girls are Jewish without being circumcised. When you join the Jewish people and convert, you actually get a new pedigree. You're referred to as son of Abraham or daughter of Sarah. And you're actually not supposed to mourn your birth parents the same way because you've been reborn. You actually have a rebirth activity with the mikveh immersion, right? Which is also baptism, but full immersion in a body of water. So there's a kind of rebirth activity there. And so Jewishness has always been a religion, but also an ethnicity and a peoplehood. It starts in a geographic area. Jew means Judean, right, from a certain area in the world. And there was a longing to return. There's no Episcopalian land that I know of that people are longing to go back to.
No, and nobody else refers to themselves for tribal. I mean, you know,
Right.
I remember there's another historian that does a lot of cavalry, and we were friends. And then one day I mentioned that I was Jewish, and he said, "Oh, I didn't know you were a member of the tribe." He was too, and he is also Jewish. You know,
Yeah,
so-
and you hear that phrasing all the time.
yeah, and it's just, but you never hear
That is
Muslims
right,
say that.
that is because of some historical, that's just an expression.
It's an
Yeah,
expression,
sure,
but
but
it suggests some certain mentality, I think, about.
well, and also when you start using terms of religion, like, are other Jews your co-religionists? I don't know. We believe such radically different things. I mean,
They're referring to ethnicity.
right,
That's how I identify myself.
right, exactly.
And when people use those expressions, as Hitler did, it's all about ethnicity. It's nothing to do with what's in your mind.
Yeah, right. And I mean, what joins together the secular kibbutznik and the ultra-Orthodox Jew in Bnei Barak, or the humanistic Jew and the ultra-Orthodox Jew in Rogers Park? I mean, we believe radically different things. We think Judaism means radically different things. We think the universe runs radically differently. We follow different ritual practices. We say different things, and we light Hanukkah candles. I mean, we're part of a common sort of cultural descent. But to say we're the same religion, it's very hard to make.
My religion is humanism. My ethnicity is Jewish.
So maybe that's a way to think about it.
Yeah, I think that's a good way, I mean, because I was raised in a humanistic household, I mean, we call it agriculture, but basically the values were the same, but I picked up enough Jewish culture along the way. That for years I was lighting Hanukkah candles without knowing what to say over them, but I lit them since I ever cut the menorah, so I mean, like for over 40 years, I've lit my own menorah. Without even knowing what now, I have the thing that the humanistic thing, so now I have to imagine,
Right.
now I have something to say, right?
Well, the other thing is that we're a religious heritage, or we're part of a religious tradition, even if our set of beliefs might not match what the historic set of beliefs, but for that matter, Reform Judaism doesn't believe what the historic beliefs said either. You look at Maimonides' 13 Principles of Faith, and I'm over 13, but there are plenty of other modern liberal rabbis who would not be 13 for 13 on that list. So we've all changed our perspective to some degree, and that's why I think of it as like an evolutionary descent. So if you went back further on the roots tree, we'd have some sort of common ancestry with Torah, Maimonides, and then it branches off far enough that we're far enough apart that we look very different and we practice very different.
The Christians do the same thing. I mean, Catholics versus Seventh-day Adventists, I mean, they hardly believe the same thing at all.
Right, right, and the sects of Islam and Buddhism.
I mean, Sunnis and Sunnis and Shiites.
Right.
And,
So we're like people, right?
Yeah, no,
We're people like other people. Okay, so let's take a look. I see a comment here. Someone says, I think member of the tribe, when someone asks, is because they don't want to say, are you Jewish? And to keep it a little bit, maybe a little quiet or secret, it's like an in joke, right?
The secret password.
Yeah, the secret password, exactly. The password.
Live
The
long and
password
prosper.
is. So the first discussion question is, what are the advantages and disadvantages of defining Judaism as a culture and civilization? So what are some of the advantages if we think about Judaism as a culture or an evolving civilization?
It just doesn't fit everything.
It's what? I'm sorry.
Well, if we describe it as a culture, for some people, it is primarily a religion, so that might be a downside. It also is not what people are used to thinking about. When they think about Jewish, they think religion. You know, they put you into that map of their mental categories, and that isn't necessarily what other people are thinking.
Well, I mean, for me, I think one of the advantages is that there's a community, you know, that you automatically are part of in a sense. And even if I'm not, I mean, even if I run into, you know, two Orthodox guys on the street, you know, handing out literature, there's still a connection somehow that's there, which I don't feel to the, you know, Catholic guy on the street particularly.
Right. Right. I mean, it does reflect how Jews behave, like sociologically.
Yeah.
Culture is much more how Jews tend to behave than purely the Western categories of religion. Keep in mind, of course, you know, what we call religion in other parts of the world may have different kind of practices. You know, Islam is very different from Christianity in many ways. And certainly African religions are very different.
So animist and Hinduism. And
Right, exactly. So, yeah, put it all into the category of religion based on belief, well, that's imposing certain categories. Other advantages to taking that cultural approach, we're open to studying and celebrating actual Jewish experiences, not just the official ideology. You know, I often use the example of a Reuben sandwich, right? Reuben sandwich is corned beef with Swiss cheese, and it's grilled and melted, right? Wonderful and greasy and terrible for you. Feels like a good Jewish sandwich, but it's corned beef with Swiss cheese,
Which is not kosher.
which is not kosher.
And sauerkraut and Russian dressing.
Right. So, you know, so the definition of Jewish food might not be limited to the definition of kosher food. And you can have kosher Chinese food that is really more Chinese food. It just happens to be kosher. There's not a Jewish, you know, narrative or root to it. So we want to study actual Jewish experiences, not just the official ideology. And this is, as I said, how most people connect to being Jewish. It's food, it's jokes, it's family history. It's not just reading the Talmud for what it says about how high your sukkah can be built and all the rules. We find also that it allows for evolution over time. You know, culture changes. Ideology, religion claims it doesn't change. It does change, but it doesn't like to claim that it changed.
Let's go.
A lot slower. where culture changes and it has influences from other places, and it's open to being part of more than one thing. Have you heard of fusion cuisine? Right? Fusion cuisine is where you get two different cultures that come together and make a fantastic mix. I once had an egg roll with chicken biryani in it that you dipped in Greek tzatziki sauce at a food cart somewhere, or a food truck. It was fantastic. But I thought only in America are you going to have this Chinese structure with the filling that's Indian and the dipping sauce that's Greek. But it was a great mix. That's fusion. That's how culture works, right? And it doesn't mean, that the person who made the biryani is not still Indian. They are, but they're able to contribute their ingredient to something else that's different. So I think that's a more open approach that reflects how people live. And honestly, for secular and cultural Jews who connect to that, this is their path through history and through Jewish identity is cultural. Now, one of the downsides to defining it primarily as a culture and civilization is that historically a lot of Judaism was around what we call religion. Believe, study the sources, believe in revelation, follow what the rabbis commanded you to do, having rabbis as clergy who are telling you what to do with your life. You take a very different approach to that. And so that is a break in continuity with.
Is this question, is the word only in here? Is that why you're using?
No.
What are the advantages and
Good point.
of only defining?
Right.
Because I would think of it differently.
Yeah, sure. Well, we have to, I might have said primarily defining it.
Okay.
But you're right, but you don't have to reject the religious stuff. After all, if you really think about it, religion is part of culture. So if you think of religion as part of culture, now that door is open to us too, because it was made by people.
Or not.
Or we can choose not to, right? We can look at the library and pick which book we want to read. We don't have to only read certain volumes. And one of the other challenges, and this is a fair one, actually two of them. One is we already alluded to the issue of tribalism. Some people don't like tribalism. They don't like feeling that there are barriers. And if you claim that being Jewish is an ethnicity, then you can't become Jewish. And should I only marry someone Jewish? And you're getting into these sort of ethnocentric or even chauvinist trends that you might be uncomfortable going in that direction. And the other challenge is, the more that we've learned about the varieties of Jewish culture, there are Jews that don't eat bagels because they're not from Ashkenazi. Well,
I don't like it.
maybe you don't like that, fine. But there are Jews that don't even have bagels in their family repertoire because they're from Syria or they're from Yemen or they're from other places in the Jewish world who have very different senses of what Jewish culture is. Their Judeo language was Judeo-Greek or Judeo-Farsi.
When did bagels start becoming part of ours?
It actually became identifiably Jewish when Jews moved here and kept eating it because it was a common food in Eastern Europe.
I don't remember even having bagels, even as a kid. That's why I don't eat them.
Wow.
I don't.
Well, different families make different choices.
We always had bagels.
But remember, bagels are an Eastern European Jewish food, and your family's German Jewish, if I remember right.
Well, my mom her dad was English,
Okay,
and my dad's were German.
yeah. So their Eastern Europeanness was much further back,
Right.
and so that's also one of the dividing lines. A lot of those German sort of establishment-oriented Jews didn't want anything to do with those other Jews. I mean, there were even like separate country clubs and
There were
dinner clubs and stuff.
My grandmother was like, they're this person's Ashkenazi, and they think they're better than us, we're Litvak, and then, the Galiciano.
Right.
Polish Jews.
Actually, the original lyrics to By Mir Bist Du Shane in the Yiddish, before it was put into German English for the Andrews sisters, was by an author named Shalom Secunda. And one of the lines was, I'm a Litvak and you're a Galiciano, but I don't care, I love you anyways. And
Yeah.
that's when those lines made a difference, but they didn't bother to translate that in German for some reason, to the English Andrews sisters version of the song.
But it seemed like most everybody I knew was like Eastern European Jewish. And,
Right,
And in New York, the sort of Hollywood created an image of Jewishness, and that was very much Eastern European based.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Exactly. Different.
I mean, Buddy Hackett, these kind of.
Oh, yeah, the Borscht
Well,
Belt.
the Germans were different.
Now, it is true that, 80% or even 90% of American Jews had that Eastern European Jewish background at one time in the country. But as we learn more about Jewish diversity globally, saying Jewish culture, well, there's Jewish cultures, period.
Yeah.
Or maybe there's a cultural family tree that has roots. After all, what's American food? Right? Well,
Chow mein.
it's our version of Chinese food and Tex-Mex and barbecue
Pizza.
and and pizza, hot dogs, so we're all over the map. So, we can have a cultural family even if there's cultural diversity. Okay,
I did want to just say that one of the disadvantages I think is is that you can be, if you define yourself as that culture in a sense, you can also be defined very easily as the other, which is what has happened.
right, well, one of the reasons why, historically, things trended towards some Jews claiming to be primarily religious was they didn't want their Judaism to be a nationality that would interfere with being a German citizen, an American citizen,
Right.
and they wanted to fit in a category that would be acceptable.
And there was a lot of opposition to
Yeah.
the Zionist movement in the 19th century by people. That was part of the opposition.
Yeah, and the exclusion of Jews was a social exclusion, not a, necessarily an ideological one. Okay, second question. Why do you think some Jews have little difficulty reciting traditional Jewish liturgy whose meaning they don't intellectually believe? And why are others not willing to do so? So this is
How important the words mean.
okay. Do the words matter to them or not? That's one
I
fact.
guess, but I like Christmas carols and I sing them all the time. So, I mean, I don't believe anything that's said.
Okay.
Well, when you said that earlier, that I am uncomfortable when I go to our friends, grandchildren's bar mitzvahs, or when there's even funerals now. I mean, I don't know how to put it. I don't want to say I'm scoffing it, but I'm just uncomfortable when the rabbis are giving their spiel. And it's Hebrew and it's about God, and I don't believe this, and I don't think anyone else does either. I don't think he does.
Sometimes they don't.
Yeah, something.
Yeah, so I mean, this is again, the not willing side of you feel hypocritical, you prioritize your personal integrity over strict tradition. I mean, you are actually following the Jewish tradition of saying what you believe and not saying what you don't believe, because there were Jews who refused to claim Christianity. Right, they stood up against the Christian consensus and said, I don't believe that, I'm going to say something different. So if we're the Jews of the Jews, right? We're just doing it back to our own group by saying we don't agree with that consensus and we're willing to say what we believe, and then we have our own dignity in doing that. But I would say that for many people, they prioritize other things. They prioritize group identity, they prioritize continuity with the past. For some people, it's a skill that was drilled into them. They had to go to Hebrew school multiple days a week to learn how to recite this as fast as they can do it, and they want to use that skill, even if it's not intellectually where they are.
And I'm sure of this, when folks who do go, twice a year, they have a need to say what they said with their grandfather when they were a child. That's a real good feeling. That's
Right.
That's
You have an emotional connection with this. I mean, I know people who have not set foot in synagogue in years and years.
This is what Grandpa and I did together. Of course, it makes sense.
Or if there's a funeral, they want to hear
Absolutely.
that Hadash recitation, Yiskadal, and not even the Israeli pronunciation. They want the old pronunciation, Yiskadal, Shemei Rabbah, with a kippah, which they never wear. But for that moment, there's an emotional thing. It's not about ideas.
And they're being honest. They think they're being honest, or believe they have been honest to their ancestors.
Right, exactly. So they might be doing it because their ancestor wanted it, or because that's the routine. That's what you need to do.
That's of course.
Well, look, how many of us do things with zero emotion? The answer is nobody. Our emotional sides of our brain are also active when we're making decisions and choices, and this kind of experience too. Again, sometimes people don't care because it's in Hebrew, so they don't know what it means. Sometimes people don't feel like they have the authority to make the changes. Right? Who are you to change this? This has been around forever, as long as I know. And what gives you the right to change this blessing or this prayer? And so they don't feel like anyone's allowed to change it. Certainly they, as an ordinary layperson, shouldn't have the right to do that. And even more important, this is the hardest barrier for us to surmount. They just have low expectations of Jewish experience. They expect to be bored. They expect not to agree with it. This is just the way it is. And, occasionally we'll have someone who will be complaining to one of our members, oh, our holiday services are 3 hours long, and I don't believe any of it, and it's totally irrelevant. And they'll say to them,
Why do you go?
well, but, why are you doing that to yourself? When I come to try something, well, I've always gone there. It's what I'm used to, and right. But they just don't raise the bar. They're willing to accept.
I run into people who have no tie. They're going to fast on Yom Kippur.
Sure, well, people doing it privately, they have their own reasoning behind it.
How do you do that? I ask. I forget the answer, but they.
Well, some people get meaning out of a personal
I'm
practice
sure they do.
and
No,
reflection
I
and so on.
understand. They have good reasons.
Right. And it may be that some people are fearing social disapproval for being different, but I mean, at this point, I think somebody joining Kol Hadash or another humanistic congregation is part of the minority that's actually a member of a synagogue somewhere. So they're less likely to get grief over actually being a member. Doesn't matter which kind you are. We're respectable enough in that sense. Okay, third question. Is it legitimate to include figures like Baruch Spinoza, Martin Buber, Mordechai Kaplan, who commonly use traditional religious language in an anthology that's called an anthology of secular humanistic Jewish thought, like Judaism in a secular age? I mean, could we claim Maimonides? Could we claim Hillel?
Well, I mean, certainly, because everything has a roots. And if you're going back to the roots, I mean, they're not jumping full-fledged out of a hole as a humanistic Jew.
Yes.
Right, and so they're going to use the language that they're familiar with in order to start to find new principles as they're thinking about it. And we draw upon all of that. So if these folks are relevant to the roots of humanistic Judaism, why would we not include them?
I mean, it really depends on where you draw your line, right? Where do they start becoming more like us and less like not us?
And that's an editorial.
Right.
That's
You know, you think of when did our evolutionary ancestors become human enough that they stop being, you know, Homo erectus and become Homo habilis or Homo sapien or Homo neanderthalis?
Homo habilis is right here.
Yeah, okay, fine, right. I never keep the.
And they're changing all the time anyways.
Yes, right. But anyways, where do you draw those lines? And
Yeah.
when is it close enough to be considered close enough to us? The further back you go, it might be different. And there's branches, you know. So this is where it's tricky to choose who you include in your roots. And by the way, if you did not include anybody who wasn't a full-fledged secularist and non-theist and creative Jewish culturalist, you wouldn't have anybody before the 19th century.
Yeah, exactly.
And that feels thin. You know, you want to be able to claim some roots earlier back, but you want to do it legitimately. You don't, this is the tricky part. You don't want to claim Hillel was a humanistic Jew or Maimonides was a closet humanist Jew and you just couldn't say it back. I don't think it's fair to do that. He has plenty of things that he wrote that suggest he was what he said he was, which was an Orthodox, or this is pre-Orthodox, so a traditional rabbinic rabbi. But some of the trends in his thought trended in our direction. So you can call him humanish. You know, he's on the way.
Well, especially with the Enlightenment, I mean, people start to have different, you know, well, the Renaissance and the Enlightenment, it breaks the established patterns, and folks are starting to have ideas, you know.
Yeah.
Like Jan Hus, or, you know.
And one other thing to keep in mind is it's not just were they a trend in our direction, but what impact did they have on the people who were us? You know, when we read Spinoza or Martin Buber or Mordechai Kaplan, who talked about Judaism as a civilization, that was his major work. Well, we're taking his concept. He taught us about how to understand Judaism in that way. So he is a root of our ideas because he had a strong influence on us, just like John Dewey and Emil Durkheim were a strong influence on Kaplan. Because Dewey actually came up with the term reconstruction in religion to redefine words and make them mean something else to be still relevant. And Emil Durkheim's religious sociology is the basis for Kaplan trying to keep tradition, but reinterpret it in new ways, where he prioritized continuity and saying most of the old words, even if you redefine them, we're more willing to change the words to say what we believe, even though our philosophies are very similar. We'll talk about Kaplan near the end of the class. Okay, number 4. What are advantages and disadvantages of having an explicit ideology?
Well, I want to have an ideology that it's concurrent to what my community is.
Right? If you agree with it, it's great.
Yeah. But as I say, the Jewish identity is important to me.
Right.
But there was no other ideology. There's parts of it that I'm distasteful.
Yep. And for some people, again, there might be individualists who don't like joining an ideological group that says, here's what we believe. Even if they agreed with all 10 principles, they don't like anything that's telling people that.
People said, you know, this is a group that are atheists.
Mhm.
Atheist is a negative term. And I don't accept that. It's not that I don't believe in some, I do believe in it.
Right. I do try to get the point across to people, though, that there's no such thing as a good humanistic Jew and a bad humanistic. You know, you're going to do it your own way, and you're going to find your, you know, your connections to tradition in your own way, and live out the values in your own way. I'm not in the business of judging. I'm not that kind of rabbi. But I'm happy to clarify basic principles, but I'm not around here to excommunicate anybody.
I think the problem with ideology comes when you begin to make the edges of it rigid. So that, you know, this is what we believe and you need to believe that or else, you know, leave the group.
Well, I guess the other difference is whether you're proselytizing about it. You know, if you're saying we're right and this applies to everybody,
Right.
That's different from saying this is what we believe. So we don't believe in a God who wrote a Torah that tells us what to eat and what to wear and who to marry. You can believe that, but we don't believe it. You have the right to believe that, but that doesn't mean that we are saying you have the right to believe it, doesn't mean that we believe it. And there are other communities where you're welcome to live out that belief and pray to that God, and that's fine. Just keep your religion off of my body. You know.
Well, that's right. And there's nothing more irritating than people coming to your door trying to hash their particular version of whatever.
Right.
Down your throat.
Although I will say there has been a temptation sometimes to send out our own missionaries and call them humangelicals. See what we can get. Okay, number 5. If you had to choose, which is more central to secular humanistic Judaism, traditional religious texts like the Talmud and Maimonides, or non-Jewish humanistic philosophers like Bertrand Russell?
It's easy for me.
I have no idea.
I mean, I don't know the philosophy of these folks, but I'm a humanist. I don't care about the tradition.
Yeah, see, it's an interesting challenge, because if I made you choose between Hanukkah and humanist philosophy, that'd be different. But choosing from the religious thought of a Maimonides or the Talmud, well, our lifestyles, our belief system is primarily secular and humanistic. But sort of our ethical roots as Jews, our communal roots, our ritual practices, when you read Maimonides' list of commandments, or you read the Talmud discussion of how they used to blow a shofar to mark the beginning of Shabbat, that's my cultural roots. And, you know, it's like picking which eye do you like better. I mean, you know, they're both part of who we are. So this question is a little bit, weighted because you're right. We don't use the Talmud as a guide to life the way we might use humanist philosophy as a guide to life. But we do draw on Jewish culture, which includes those texts, as part of our expression of our community and sometimes our values. But I guess the difference I would make is we filter those texts through the philosophy.
Yeah.
If I want to find a quote I like from the Hebrew Bible, it's through that lens of humanist philosophy. I'm not doing it just because it's in the Bible. So love your neighbor as yourself. Great. Do not oppress the stranger because you were a stranger. Great. Stone the heretic who collects sticks on the Sabbath. Forget it.
Kill the Jebusites. Yeah.
Kill the Jebusites, those
Yeah.
damn Jebusites. Right. The point is that we don't do it just because it's in the Bible or traditional. We have our lens through which we are analyzing. And again, it's not that other movements don't do that. They might be less explicit about it, but we're willing to admit it. And then finally, why is it important for secular humanistic Jews to define their approach in positive terms?
Is there any way that the people on Zoom can respond to this?
Yeah, they can unmute.
I was thinking about that. I wonder if they vanished because
No, they're still there.
okay.
So-
I'm just thinking that
They're
we're
not
sort of
shy.
dominating everything.
Well, I've seen a couple of chats in the chat box that I brought in. I think they're awake. I don't know.
Are you awake, Alan? He's muted.
Yeah, so that last question, why is it important for us to define our approach in positive terms? Well, I call it humanistic Judaism in a more positive way.
No, I'm not awake, you say.
To me, it's critical. I mean, I don't, like I said earlier, I don't want to find something that's just things that are negative. That's just not my style. So I'm proud of the fact that it's about that you don't have to be an atheist to be here.
Mhm.
And I'm sure many aren't.
I love a poem that we included in one of the high holiday services recently. It's called I Just Say Yes, or it's not called I Just Say Yes. There's no title on it actually, but the premise of the poem is, I used to read all these words and then I realized I couldn't believe in that God when this tragedy happened. But saying no is not for me. I want to say yes. I want to say yes to a child's fingernails, and I want to say yes to a beautiful soap bubble. And I want, I'm not going to focus on who or why. I'm just going to say yes. And I love that approach of, we have to find positive meaning in the world. If you want to transmit it to your kids, you can't raise kids to not do something. Like, I can't raise my kids to not fast on Yom Kippur because they've never fasted or had to fast on Yom Kippur. So I'm not raising them to not follow a practice that I haven't trained them in to begin with. You can't train the rebel. They're going to rebel against you, whatever you provided positively, but it helps to provide a positive identity instead. Also, it's much more strong to be in a position to be for something. Believers are in a stronger position than non-believers or anti-believers. So we can frame what we do in positive terms. I believe in human rights. I believe in human freedom. I believe in the power of the rational mind. And frankly, it's more inspirational to be positive than to be negative.
I don't think I think there's very few people in the world who don't have some positive. I mean, even if it's just leave me alone, and because I want to do these things, that's still a positive affirmation of something that person wants to do. I mean, being totally negative about everything is almost unsupportable.
No, that's true.
That's right, somebody relatives.
Yeah.
So what's that? I'm sorry.
You haven't met some of my relatives. I mean,
Oh, okay. Well,
some people can be
maybe I don't
negative
want to be.
about everything, but that's
But they can be negative.
sad.
It is sad. I
Well,
mean,
and it's a negative side that doesn't attract people, that isn't uplifting. I mean, if I were like that, would want to be part of the community,
well, yeah, I mean, one of the things that I find so turning off about a lot of things, is thou shalt not, and everything, thou shalt not, thou shalt not, thou shalt not. And they're like, okay, well, what shall we do? I mean, at some point.
Yeah.
And one of the things that I'm very pleased with my own parents was that, coming from very different backgrounds, that they had a very positive and humanistic vision of life and how to go about living it, and it's interesting that coming from such diverse background that they managed to do that and come together in a love relationship which lasted for 44 years or whatever it was, and raise us in a very positive fashion, so that even as a kid, when my brother was a teenager, he went down to register voters down in Tuscaloosa, Alabama, right during the civil rights era. I mean, these were the values that we were given, and I think that comes from both of my heritages that they were positive.
I think also, I mean, in addition to this, yes, and when you're going to have community boundaries, it's stronger to clarify them from a positive perspective. To say, here's why we're doing this for these positive reasons. Not that we don't do this or we hate that or we're not that. And we're not just rejecting tradition. We're not allergic to God. We've made positive statements of what we believe and who we are. I mean, we'll use the word no and not occasionally. That becomes a language game just to avoid that. But our self-esteem is improved by saying why we do what we do and who we are in a positive sense. So I think that it's a stronger stance to be in. And after all, like, in theory, the Republican Party is not the anti-Democrat party. And the Democratic Party is not the anti-Republican party. They have positive positions that they stand for and platforms they want to see happen and actions they think would improve society. And you have a platform that says what you stand for. And that not just that you're opposed to somebody else or you define yourself in relation to someone else. They set the categories and you just have to respond and say, no, 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 no. If we set the categories, if we understand who we are in a positive sense, I think that provides a much more inspirational, uplifting, and emotional, and intellectually consistent approach to
So our
it.
society is turned on more by negative. They are.
No question.
Political positions, it's the ones that are effective are negative.
Unfortunately, yes, but we don't have to acquiesce. We can buck the trend just like we're, swimming against the stream in other ways. We can do that too.